All right, welcome back. So today we are going to begin Unit 2 of our World History curriculum. This is the topic on the Silk Roads. So let's begin. So the thematic learning objective for this lecture is going to be economics. Um, the learning objective that I want you to leave this lesson with is be able to explain the causes and effects of the growth of networks of exchange after 1200. Historically, improved commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded the geographical range of existing trade routes, including the Silk Roads, promoting the growth of powerful new trading cities. The growth of interregional trade in luxury goods was encouraged by innovations in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies, including the caravanserai, forms of credit, and the development of money economies. Demand for luxury goods increased in Afro-Eurasia. Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants expanded their production of textiles and porcelains for export. Manufacture of iron and steel expanded in China. So, what are the Silk Roads? Well, the term Silk Roads refers to the network of exchange across Afro-Eurasia that connected regions through both overland and maritime trade routes. This map here shows some of the major routes of the Silk Road networks around the year 1200 CE. Overland routes are marked in red while the ocean routes are blue. This is not an exhaustive map of the Silk Road trade routes, as there were plenty of smaller routes, and routes changed over time for various reasons. But this does show us how Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa were connected at the beginning of this time period. This lecture focuses on the causes and effects of the growth of trade networks, with emphasis on the Silk Roads as our example. The name Silk Roads was derived from the trade of Chinese silk along these routes. Silk, as we recall from Unit 1, was highly valued, but many other items were also traded along these routes as well. So let's examine the causes of the growth of the Silk Roads. We will first take a look at what helped cause the growth and expansion of trade networks after 1200. The Silk Roads were helped by many coinciding factors, including new empires like the Mongol Empire. Conquest often leads to new connections. The Crusades, same idea, conquest leads to new encounters and connections. Growing demand for foreign goods, and improvements in both commercial practices and transportation technology. For trade to expand, there has to be progress in both how transactions are made and in how goods are moved. We will take a more in-depth look at each of these causes on the next slides. So the Crusades and the Silk Roads. The Crusades, as we touched upon in topic 1.6, developments in Europe, were a series of wars between Christians and Muslims that took place from 1096 CE to 1291 CE. European Christians were directed by the Pope to wage war against Muslims, and in one of the most significant conflicts of the Crusades, European Christians pushed into Jerusalem in an effort to retake the holy city from Islamic control. Through this process of war, European knights traveled thousands of miles to reach the Holy Land and encountered part of the Silk Roads along the way. It was at these crossroads that Europeans acquired silks and other goods from East Asia and brought them back to Europe. This had the effect of increasing European demand for silk, porcelain, spices, and other goods traded along the Silk Roads. Conversely, East Asia's desire for European gold and silver increased through these long-distant interactions, and global trade began to rise, causing growth in the Silk Roads. Crusaders and the Silk Roads crossed paths. The blue arrow on this map shows where the overland routes of the Silk Roads ended in the west, while the red arrow shows where the farthest Crusades routes reached to the east. This is where the Crusaders met the Silk Roads and created that connection that helped to spur the growth of the Silk Roads. The rise of the Mongol Empire. Before we get to how the Mongol Empire influenced the growth of the Silk Roads, let's dig into a little context first. We will explore the Mongols in greater detail in topic 2.2. In the 12th century, the 1100s, the Mongols consisted of several nomadic clans in Central Asia. In 1206, Genghis Khan, who's pictured here, had formed alliances between many of these clans and brought the Mongols under a united kingdom with himself as the head. Genghis Khan was not his real name, but a name bestowed upon him that meant ruler of all. His reign began an era of conquest and expansion. And the map on this slide, it shows that the Mongol Empire at its height in 1294. The green portion represents Mongol territory. Now recall from Unit 1, Topic 1.2, Dar al-Islam, that Baghdad was sieged and taken by the Mongols in 1258. You can see the city of Baghdad on the western edge of the Mongol Empire in the map on this slide. Take note of the location of the territory united under Mongol rule in 1294 as we transition back to the Silk Roads. So this map shows the Mongol Empire in 1294 in green. The overland Silk Roads routes are in red, and some of the Silk Roads sea routes are in blue. So I have a question. Based on this map, how might the expansion of the Mongol Empire have contributed to the growth of the Silk Roads? I want you to pause this video and think about that for a minute. So the Mongol Empire improves trade. The expansion of the Mongol Empire was arguably one of the leading contributors to the growth of trade along the Silk Roads in this time period. Before the Mongol Empire controlled the territory shown on the previous slides, various sections of the Silk Roads were under control of different states, which were often at war with one another. Once the Mongols took the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258, the siege of Baghdad, and later expanded into China with the defeat of the Song dynasty, a majority of the overland routes existed under a unified empire. The Mongols respected merchants and therefore took measures to safeguard the routes and those that traveled them. It became far safer to use the Silk Roads, and this greatly helped to facilitate trade. They also reopened several routes which had not been in much use since the Roman Empire and the Han dynasty controlled them. That's another example of how vast empires aided long-distance trade. The huge and powerful empire invested in improving roads so travel for merchants became easier and faster. It was during this period that Marco Polo traveled parts of the Silk Roads on his famed journey. When you look back at the map on the previous slide, you can clearly see just how much of the routes were under Mongol administration. East Asia all the way to Eastern Europe and the Middle East became safer and easier to travel after Mongol expansion. So we have a growing demand for luxury goods. China had developed a strong upper class throughout the Song dynasty, and members of the upper class sought luxury items such as cotton, horses, and different fruits which were not found in China. Conversely, wealthy people in the Middle East and in Europe sought the luxury goods of China, such as silk, porcelain, and tea. These demands, coupled with the connections established through the Crusades and the stability brought by the Mongol Empire, led to higher volumes of trade along the Silk Roads. So we see improvements in commercial practices. Recall from Unit 1 the advancement in the economy of Song China prior to the Mongol conquest. China had long moved away from a barter economy in which goods were traded for commodities like salt to a money economy. Money in China began as metal coins made from copper or silver. These coins were heavy and they were cumbersome. So when it came to trade and transactions along the Silk Roads, paper money and banking houses were developed. At any bank house, a merchant could deposit paper money and then withdraw the same amount of paper money at a different banking house. This is sometimes referred to as flying cash. Banking houses could also issue and accept bills of exchange, which were written documents that promised that a set of payment on a certain date for the holder. Basically, this was like checks, paper checks, although not quite the same. The piece of paper essentially ensures the transfer of money between two people without those two people physically exchanging the money. This eliminated the need to carry heavy coins while traveling the Silk Roads and greatly enabled long-distance trade. We also see advancements in transportation. While this naval technology had been developed in Han China prior to the 1200-1450 time period we are studying, there are still crucial elements to the growth of the Silk Road maritime routes. The Chinese developed the magnetic compass, which aided in navigation and made longer journeys possible. The rudder, which helps control the actual ship, was greatly improved upon by the Chinese. And the Chinese junk ship, shown on this slide, was a large and strong ship that could carry large amounts of goods and was adept at surviving rough waters. Looking inland, the rise of the Caravassae aided in transportation and travel through overland routes. As the Silk Roads opened up, the need for pit stops arose. A caravanserai was a place where merchants could stop to rest themselves and their camels. They generally spaced about 100 miles apart because this is how far camels can travel before needing water. Caravanserai made extremely long distances possible to cover. So let's take a quick recap as to what the causes of the growth of the Silk Roads were. Now, you should be able to explain several of these causes when you encounter a free response question on the exam dealing with the subject of the Silk Roads or networks of exchange. So having these marked down in your notes, studying these is going to be very crucial for you. So the Crusade paths, they intersected the Silk Roads, and that is going to lead to the growth of the Silk Roads. The Mongol Empire, they unified the territory and created safer routes, expanding the Silk Roads. Increased demand for luxury goods. Expensive luxury goods grew in demand, which also increased trade volume. So that expanded the growth of the Silk Roads. And lastly, those transportation improvements. Caravanserai and maritime transportation tools improved the ability to travel further. So that also expanded the growth of the Silk Roads. Now we're going to switch to looking at the causes of growth to the effects of the growth of the Silk Roads. Some major results of the expansion and the use of Silk Roads included new trading cities and caravanserai, and the spread of goods, ideas, culture, and disease, changes in economy, and a rise in both production and urbanization in places that are connected to the Silk Roads. So we see new trading cities emerge. Samarkand and Kashgar were two cities that became thriving centers of trade as the Silk Roads grew during this time period. We'll cover a few other cities when we touch on urbanization later. But for now, let's talk about Samarkand and Kashgar. Samarkand, located in present-day Uzbekistan in the Zur-Avshan River Valley, became a major stopping point along the Silk Roads that connected China and the Mediterranean. Because the city was built around this cross-cultural trade, it was an incredibly diverse city that featured various religions including Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and others. Kashgar is located on the very western edge of present-day China, and it was a prominent destination on the Silk Roads because of its geographic location. It is the location where Taklamakan Desert ends and the Tian Shan Mountains of China begin. The Kashgar River runs by the city, which is why it was such an important stop for those coming from or going through the dry Taklamakan Desert. This city, too, grew in diversity as it became a center of trade. Here pictured is a painting depicting a bazaar in Samarkand. So let's revisit that idea of the caravanserai. The Silk Roads at their longest were about 4,000 miles, or about 6,400 kilometers long. It is important to note here that this doesn't mean a single caravan of merchants traveled the entire length of the routes. Rather, it was common for merchants to traverse just specific sections of the Silk Roads. With that in mind, many parts of the roads went through inhospitable terrain, such as the Gobi and the Taklamakan deserts. We briefly discussed the caravanserai as one of the factors that led to the growth of the Silk Roads because they made travel through dry deserts possible, but many sprang up as a result of increased trading along the Silk Roads as well. These caravanserai were not cities, but more akin to something like a motel adjacent to a truck stop on our modern interstates or highways. In the dry, arid regions of the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan Desert, these caravanserai were a necessary part of a merchant's life. At these stops, they could replenish water supplies, obtain fresh food, rest themselves and their animals, and even trade in their animals for ones that were ready for the next leg of travel. Many caravanserai were oases, areas in an arid, dry desert climate that had water and or fertile land. One of the most obvious results of the revival and growth of the Silk Roads was the transfer of goods, culture, and disease. The purpose of these routes was to move goods, so we already know that textiles like cotton and silk moved into new regions, horses were brought to new places, porcelain goods from China made it to Italy, and spices and tea moved far and wide. Aside from the intentional movement of these goods was the movement of religions and disease as well. New connections often result in cultural transfers, and they open up areas to new diseases. Islam spread eastward through the Silk Roads and many trading ports, particularly ones near the maritime trading ports in Southeast Asia, which had Muslim populations. Christianity and Buddhism also diffused through these trade networks. The plague, also known as the Black Death, originated in Central Asia and spread through the Silk Road trading routes until it reached Europe in the mid-1300s. Connection allows for the spread of communicable diseases, and the plague, which killed more than 50 million people, is the first example of a true pandemic. So we learned in Unit 1 that the Song dynasty, which preceded the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, had the most advanced and sophisticated tax system in the world. This was due to the fact that they levied taxes in the form of money, usually silver, instead of by way of land tax, where products of the land were used as tax payments. As the Silk Roads were revived after the Mongol Empire made improvements to their safety and structure, China's advanced economic systems spread and developed right along with the growth of the Silk Roads. China was the first state to develop a money economy, one in which money, in the form of metal coins initially and paper money later, was used to purchase goods. Money economies replaced barter economies, in which goods were traded for commodities like salt or cowrie shells, which is pictured here. The movement to a money economy and the development of paper money and banking houses provided a convenience and stability to financial transactions that was absent from earlier bartering systems. The Silk Roads effectively took China's advanced money system and helped spread and improve them. Paper money and banking houses, which came about as a result of the Silk Roads, are the early form of our modern banks and money systems. Money economies spread west, out of China, and eventually made it all the way to Europe. So we see increased production and urbanization. As the Silk Roads grew, demand for goods from faraway regions grew. For example, Italy's upper class demanded porcelain and silk textiles from China. This demand created an incentive to increase production. We learned in Unit 1 about how China became a commercialized society and how that commercialization led to urbanization. When production demand increases, more efficient methods of production are developed. Production overall then increases. Commercialized societies produce for export rather than just local consumption. This requires that people who work to produce goods move into more dense city areas, and that is urbanization. Urban areas import the goods needed for everyday life, such as food items, so that those people can focus on the production of goods for export. We originally explored this concept in relation to the Song dynasty. New urban areas developed elsewhere, such as Samarkand and Kashgar, as a result of the Silk Roads. The demand for goods that were traded along the Silk Roads caused an overall increase of goods production and urbanization. In addition to the production of luxury goods, the manufacturing of iron and steel in China increased as well. So we see urbanized trade cities. There are some examples of cities that grew and urbanized during this time period as a result of trade. And this map here and these cities are here to illustrate that the reach of the effects of the trade networks at this time. Hangzhou in China experienced population growth and urbanization as a direct result of the need to ramp up production of silk for export. Other cities that grew and became major trading cities outside of China include Malacca in modern-day Malaysia, Timbuktu in West Africa, Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan, Constantinople in modern-day Turkey, and Damascus in Syria. This is not an exhaustive list of cities that grew or were affected by the Silk Roads, but rather a list of examples in various regions. Now, a quick note. We are not covering the maritime Silk Roads in Malacca or Southeast Asia in much detail in this topic because we will go further into those areas when we cover the Indian Ocean trade later in this unit and in Unit 4. Similarly, Timbuktu falls within the topic of the trans-Saharan trade routes. So let's quickly take a look at a Silk Road primary source. This is an excerpt from an account of the travels of the Spanish ambassador Ruy González de Clavijo to the court of Tamerlane between 1402 and 1406. And it reads, "On the next morning following, we set out from the encampment on the Tehen River under escort of that lord Mirabazar, whom Timur had sent to meet us, and as we shall explain, we traveled without ever halting that day and the following night and the next day throughout, never passing by any settlement or village. The first night we slept at a great caravanserai in the desert, where they gave the horses we had brought their barley, and here we learned that the stage from this caravanserai to the next resting place was 12 long leagues. Some 2 hours after nightfall, therefore, we set out again, fresh good horses being provided at the post house for our use. All through that night we rode, and the heat not abating the air was most oppressive. Also, nowhere on the road did we come to any water. When morning came, which was Monday, we still continued our journey, and up to the hour of none, namely 3 o'clock of the afternoon, went on without finding water, good or bad, for man or horse to drink. We had so ridden hard all that last night and this day that the horses were now quite tired out, and barely able to go at a walk. Also, by reason of the great heat of the sun that day on the road here over the sands, they came near at last to perishing of thirst. We men too were very like to have succumbed for that same want of water, had not a youth in the service of our master in theology had a better horse than the rest, who now made haste to ride on ahead before us. Then, fortunately, at last he discovered a stream where, taking off his smock, he dipped it in the water and returned quickly, bringing the smock to us, who as many as could quenched somewhat of our thirst thereby. Most of us, indeed, were like to have fainted from the great heat and the lack that we suffered of water to drink. And each man rode his own way. Our escort no longer was keeping up with us, and all struggled on as best might. So, a couple notes here. A league is almost 3.5 miles. This passage begins on Sunday morning, and for this reading, I'm not asking you to get too caught up in who Roy Gonzalez de Clavijo is or what his business was with Tamerlane. Tamerlane will actually be covered in Unit 3. Rather, the goal is just to focus on the conditions of this desert section of the Silk Roads and the role of the described caravanserai. The questions that I want you to answer are on the next slide, and they're also on your guided note packet. All right, so I want you to go ahead and answer these following questions here. Number 1, what services were offered at the caravanserai mentioned in this excerpt? Number 2, why did they wait until nightfall to set out the next leg of the trip? 3, describe the conditions of this desert travel in your own words. And 4, what does this tell us about the role of the caravanserai in the expansion and the growth of the Silk Road trade networks? Okay, so that is it for topic 2.1. Here are your key ideas for review. Now, once again, these are the major points that you should be familiar with for 2.1. I would make sure to write these down in your notes, make sure you have them, study them. These are what you need to know for sure for the exam. Have a good day.